My mother-in-law spent 9 years treating me like I was a stain on her family name, and my husband spent 9 years pretending that silence was the same thing as loyalty. She insulted the way I looked, the way I cooked, the way I spoke, the way I raised my children, and even the family I came from. She did it at holidays, birthdays, family dinners, church events, and any gathering where she had an audience. And every single time I looked at my husband, hoping that maybe this would finally be the moment he stood up and said enough, he found a softer word for her cruelty. He said she was old-fashioned. He said she had a sharp personality. He said she did not mean it the way it sounded. But the day finally came when that same man stood in my kitchen, pale and shaking, begging me to help him save the woman who had spent years humiliating me. He said he could not handle her alone. He said he needed me to choose a side. What he did not understand was that he had already made his choice years earlier, and by the time he finally realized that, I had already made mine. Before I tell you exactly how it all fell apart, tell me where you're watching from tonight, because I always love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy slow-burn betrayal, toxic family drama, and revenge that takes its time but lands exactly where it should, stay with me, because this story does not end with me screaming, begging, or throwing anything. It ends with patience, proof, a room full of witnesses, and one perfect moment when the people who had spent years trying to make me feel small realized they had completely lost control of the story. When I met my husband, Nathan, I thought his calmness was one of the best things about him. He was polite, measured, steady, the kind of man who listened before he spoke and never seemed rattled by anything. After years of dating men who treated every disagreement like a competition, Nathan felt safe. He called when he said he would. He remembered little things. He made plans. He followed through. He talked about wanting a peaceful life, a stable marriage, children, and a home that felt safe at the end of a hard day. I truly believed I had found a man who understood what real partnership looked like. What I did not understand yet was that some men only look peaceful because the women around them have spent their entire lives absorbing conflict for them, and some men only seem kind because they have never been forced to choose between their comfort and someone else's dignity. I met his mother, Valerie, 3 months before our wedding. Nathan warned me that she could be a little intense, but he said it with a smile, the way people do when they have normalized something ugly for so long that they can only describe it in harmless words. The first thing she said to me was not hello. She looked me up and down and asked, "So what exactly is it you bring to my son's life?" I laughed because I honestly thought she was joking. She wasn't. At dinner she asked where my parents lived, what kind of work my father had done, whether my mother had gone to college, and how long my family had lived in the same town. The questions came one after another like she was collecting evidence. When I answered politely, she gave me a thin smile and said, "Well, it's nice that Nathan has never cared too much about status." The table went quiet for half a second, and I remember looking at Nathan because surely he had heard that. He smiled weakly, reached for his glass, and said nothing. That was my first lesson. Valerie did not test boundaries. She announced the hierarchy, and Nathan had been raised to survive her by acting as if nothing had happened. I should have understood then what kind of marriage I was walking into, but people rarely leave at the first warning sign when they are in love. You explain things away. You tell yourself families are complicated. You tell yourself the wedding stress is making everyone tense. You tell yourself that once you and your husband are in your own life, your own home, things will settle. But things did not settle. They expanded. At our engagement dinner, Valerie told one of Nathan's aunts, loudly enough for me to hear, that she had always imagined him ending up with someone, a little more polished. At my bridal shower, she picked up a handmade gift my mother had spent weeks preparing and called it very charmingly homemade. At the rehearsal dinner, she told the caterer in front of me that not everyone at the table had grown up around refined food, so she hoped the menu was not too ambitious. Every single time, people shifted awkwardly, and every single time Nathan found a way to let the moment die without ever making his mother pay for it. Later, in private, he would say she had gone a little too far. He would say he wished she had phrased it differently. He would say I should not let her get under my skin. Never once did he say the one sentence that actually mattered: "Don't speak to my wife that way." After we got married, Valerie's cruelty changed shape. Before the wedding, it was about my background. After the wedding, it became about my worth, I was not elegant enough. I did not host correctly. I dressed too plainly for some occasions and too boldly for others. I laughed too loudly. I spoke too directly. I used the wrong serving dishes at holidays. I did not understand how certain families carried themselves. If I cooked, she corrected my seasoning. If I ordered food, she implied women who could not run a proper home eventually lost their husbands. If I wore makeup, I was trying too hard. If I did not, I looked tired. Nothing was ever overt enough for strangers to instantly call it abuse, but it was always precise enough to wound. That is the trick with women like Valerie. They do not want one explosive scene. They want erosion. They want to make you doubt your place, your instincts, and eventually your own memory. And the second layer of the cruelty was always Nathan, because he insisted on translating her behavior into something easier to live with. He would say she criticizes everyone. He would say that is just how she shows concern. He would say I was too smart to let little comments bother me, but they were never little, and they were never random. Valerie did not criticize everyone. She criticized anyone she believed she could dominate. Everything became worse when I had our daughter, Emma. Motherhood sharpened my understanding of what was happening because the stakes changed. It was one thing for Valerie to insult me as a wife. It was something else entirely for her to undermine me as a mother. Suddenly, every choice I made became material for her. If Emma cried, it was because she sensed my anxiety. If Emma was clingy, it was because I had made her too dependent. If Emma got sick, it was because my routines were too soft. When I breastfed, Valerie said modern women loved making babies overly attached. When I switched to bottles, she hinted that some women gave up the hard parts of motherhood too easily. When I returned to work part-time, she told Nathan that children always know when their mothers are mentally elsewhere. If Emma reached for Nathan instead of me, Valerie would smile and say, "She knows who the stable parent is." That one made my whole body go cold, and Nathan heard it. He heard it clearly. Later that night, when I asked why he said nothing, he rubbed his face and told me his mother was from a different generation and did not know how to communicate gently. I remember staring at him and thinking, no, she communicates perfectly. You just prefer the version of reality where this is all one big misunderstanding, because the truth would require courage from you. The first moment that truly changed me happened on Emma's 6th birthday. Valerie insisted on hosting a family lunch at her house. I did not want it there, but Nathan told me she had promised to behave and said he would make sure nothing happened. I agreed because I was tired of being blamed every time I set a boundary. The house was full of relatives, neighbors, church friends, and women who loved Valerie because they only ever saw the polished public version of her. After cake, she wheeled out a large silver box tied with cream ribbon and made a speech about family, heritage, and the importance of children understanding where they come from. Everyone smiled. Emma opened the box and found a beautiful leather-bound photo album. At first, I thought it was actually thoughtful. Then Valerie opened it for her. Page after page was filled with photos of Nathan as a baby, Nathan as a boy, Nathan's parents, grandparents, cousins, weddings, baptisms, holidays, old black and white portraits, handwritten captions about legacy and family pride. There were hundreds of photos. I was in none of them. Not one. On the first page, written in Valerie's careful script, was a dedication that read, "So you will always remember where you truly belong." Emma flipped a few pages and then looked up at me and asked, in the sweetest, confused little voice, "Mommy, where are you?" The room went dead silent. I looked at Nathan. Even then, after all those years, some foolish, hopeful part of me thought surely this would be the moment. Surely no father would sit there while his own daughter asked why her mother had been erased from a family gift. But Nathan forced a smile and said, "Grandma was just making a memory book from our side of the family." Our side. I can still hear those words. Valerie smiled like a woman receiving applause. One guest awkwardly said the album was lovely, someone changed the subject, and the party moved on. But something in me ended right there in that room full of balloons and paper plates, and smiling people pretending not to notice what had just happened. That night after Emma was asleep, I asked Nathan whether he truly understood what his mother had done. He told me I was reading too much into it. He said she was just trying to connect Emma to family history. I asked him, "And what am I then?" He sighed like I was exhausting him and said, "Why does everything have to become a fight?" That was the moment I stopped trying to be understood. I did not stop noticing. I did not stop hurting. I did not forgive. I simply stopped bringing my pain to a man who needed to minimize it in order to keep living comfortably with himself. Instead, I changed strategies. I became very calm, very organized, and very observant. I stopped arguing after family gatherings. I stopped asking for apologies. I stopped telling Valerie how hurtful she was because cruel people do not need education. They need consequences. And since no one else was ever going to provide those consequences, I started preparing to create them myself. I began documenting everything. Dates, comments, witnesses, messages, emails, all of it. I saved texts from Valerie criticizing my parenting and suggesting Emma needed stronger family influence. I saved messages from Nathan admitting his mother had gone too far, but begging me not to make things worse. I kept notes on every event where I was insulted in front of other people. Every time Valerie ignored a boundary with our children. Every time Nathan asked me to absorb the damage quietly so he did not have to deal with the fallout. At first I told myself I was doing it because I was tired of being told that I was exaggerating or imagining patterns that were not there. But over time, I realized it was more than that. I was building a record because some part of me already knew the day would come when truth would matter more than anyone's feelings. And when that day arrived, I was going to be ready. Then the betrayal widened from emotional to financial. The year Emma turned 7, Nathan started acting strange about money. It was subtle at first. He became defensive when I asked about small transfers. He insisted on handling certain bills himself. He brushed off growing balances as temporary cash flow issues. He reassured me too quickly whenever I noticed something missing from our savings. At first I thought he was embarrassed because my career had taken off while his had stalled. I was earning more by then, and while I never held that over him, I could feel the bruising effect it had on his ego. But one night he left his laptop open on the home office desk, and while I was trying to print a school form for Emma, I saw an email thread with the subject line, "Urgent Payment Notice." I would love to tell you I walked away. I didn't. I saw Valerie's name in the message chain and sat down. 2 hours later, my entire understanding of my marriage had changed. Valerie was drowning in debt, and not the manageable kind. She had refinanced the house twice without being honest about it. She had taken out private loans to maintain appearances, keep up memberships, fund renovations no one needed, and continue hosting the social events that convinced everyone she was still thriving. There were late notices, payment demands, warnings about liens, property tax issues, and the kind of correspondence people receive when collapse is no longer theoretical. And Nathan had been secretly using money from our joint savings to keep her afloat. Not once, repeatedly. Small transfers at first, then larger ones, then a personal loan in his own name, then payments routed through an account he thought I did not know existed. I kept reading, and somehow it got worse. Valerie referred to my income as useful compensation for the embarrassment of your marriage. She told Nathan not to tell me because women like her never understand what older families carry. She called the money family duty and told him that if he let the house go, he would be the son who destroyed his father's legacy. And my husband replied with things like, "I know, and I'm handling it, and she doesn't need to know right now." I sat there in the dark office staring at that screen and realized I had spent years asking the wrong question. It was never just why he would not defend me. The real question was how much of this he quietly agreed with, and the answer was more than I had ever wanted to know. I did not confront him that night, and I am still proud of that. The old version of me would have stormed into our bedroom shaking with rage and demanded explanations. The new version understood that when people think you do not know, they keep building the case against themselves. So I waited. I watched. I gathered more. I checked statements, traced transfers, copied notices, photographed documents, and found the second loan he had signed. I found a delayed payment for Emma's tutoring program during the same month he had transferred Valerie enough money to cover one of her social club obligations. That was the moment every last bit of confusion died. He had not been torn between his wife and his mother. He had chosen, over and over again. He had chosen the woman who humiliated me because disappointing her frightened him more than betraying me and our children. Once I knew that, I was no longer interested in arguments. I was interested in timing. And Valerie, being Valerie, built the perfect stage for me herself. A few months later, she announced a grand anniversary dinner for her and Nathan's father. It was obvious to anyone paying attention that the event was not about romance. It was about image control. Rumors had started circulating. People had noticed certain changes. Invitations had slowed. A few old friends had become distant. Valerie needed a performance large enough to overwrite the whispers. She rented a hall in an old estate house, hired a quartet, arranged gold place cards, built a display table full of family photographs, and planned one of her self-important speeches about legacy and sacrifice. Nathan begged me to go. He said his father's health was fragile and this meant a lot to him. He said the family needed unity. He said whatever tension existed, we could talk privately later. In other words, he said all the things weak men say when they want women to postpone consequences until after the important guests have gone home. I told him I would go, and that one yes made both of them careless. Valerie even texted me 2 days before the event to tell me what color I should wear because certain shades photograph more gracefully on women with stronger features. I saved that too. The night of the anniversary dinner, I looked exactly the way Valerie always hated most, composed. I wore a dark fitted dress, simple jewelry, and the kind of calm that cruel people find threatening because they cannot tell whether they still have access to your pain. The room was full of relatives, business acquaintances, church friends, neighbors, and old family contacts who had spent years hearing Valerie's version of reality. Through dinner, she performed beautifully. She laughed at the right moments. She thanked people with grace. She kissed her husband's cheek for the cameras. She introduced my children as the next generation. Once, as she passed behind my chair, she leaned down and whispered, "Try not to look so tense tonight. People can always tell when someone feels out of place." I almost smiled right then, because what she thought was still happening and what was actually about to happen were living in completely different worlds. After dessert, the speeches began. Nathan's sister went first, then an old family friend, then Nathan. His speech was polished and emotional and full of words about sacrifice, family devotion, tradition, and everything his mother had supposedly taught him about loyalty. I stood there clapping with everyone else while the folder in my bag felt like a second pulse. Then Valerie gave her speech. She thanked God, her husband, her family, and those who have married into this family and tried, in their own way, to keep up with the standards we hold dear. People laughed softly. She raised her glass and said that family is not just love, it is duty, and that some names carry responsibility that not everyone is prepared for. There it was, one last elegant little cut. One last public reminder that no matter how much I had done for that family, in her mind I was still an outsider asking to be tolerated. So I stood up and smiled and said, "Actually, before we finish, I'd love to say a few words too." The room quieted immediately. Valerie looked surprised and then pleased. She thought I was finally about to hand her the tribute she believed she deserved. A microphone was passed to me, and I walked to the center of the room slowly, calmly, looking at all those polished faces waiting for something sentimental. I began gently. I said Valerie was right about one thing: family is duty. Family is sacrifice. Family is what you choose to protect when it would be easier to stay silent. I watched people nod. I watched them relax into what they assumed was going to be a graceful little acknowledgement. Then I said that for years I had been told family also meant patience, tolerance, grace, and not making scenes. I said I had spent 9 years trying to honor family in exactly that way by staying polite when I was insulted, staying quiet when I was erased, and protecting private matters out of respect for the people involved. The room shifted then. It was subtle, but it changed. People sat up straighter. Nathan's face tightened. Valerie's smile stiffened. And then I said, "But there comes a point when silence stops being noble and starts becoming permission." You could feel the air leave the room. I reached into my bag, pulled out the first set of documents, and asked the nearest server if he would help me pass them toward the main table. The sound of paper moving across a room full of dressed-up people is strangely loud when everyone suddenly realizes they are no longer attending a celebration but a reckoning. I said that since the evening was so beautifully focused on legacy, tradition, and responsibility, it only seemed fair to acknowledge what had been happening behind the scenes to preserve the appearance of all three. Then I began. I said that while Valerie had spent years lecturing me about class, dignity, and family standards, she had quietly accumulated enormous debt to maintain an image she could no longer afford. I said that while she publicly questioned whether I truly belonged in the family, she had privately relied on money taken from the savings intended for her grandchildren's future. I said that while she loved to talk about legacy, she had been willing to risk her son's stability, my children's security, and my marriage itself to finance a performance for the exact kind of people sitting in that room. Murmurs broke out immediately, but I was not done, because this was never only about Valerie. I turned toward Nathan and said that because truth mattered, I also needed to say this clearly. None of it would have been possible without my husband. I said that the same man who had spent years asking me to be patient while I was humiliated in public had been secretly using our shared money to protect the woman humiliating me in private. I held up the transfer records. I held up the messages where Valerie told him not to tell me because women like me would never understand what older families carried. I held up the response where he said he was handling it. Then I said, with more calm than I knew I possessed, so when I was told not to overreact, not to make things personal, and not to create scenes, what I was really being asked to do was stay quiet while my dignity was traded for appearances and my children's future was used to finance someone else's pride. At that point, the room was no longer quiet in the polite way. It was alive. People were whispering. Someone near the back had stopped pretending not to read. Nathan's sister looked stunned. Valerie was pale with rage and humiliation. She stood up and demanded that I stop speaking, and that was the moment I looked directly at her and said, "You spent years making sure every humiliation happened in front of an audience. It only seemed fair that the truth did too." That line landed exactly the way I had imagined it would. The beauty of the moment was that I never screamed, never insulted her, never lost control. I simply let facts do what years of polite endurance never could. Then I said the final thing I had come there to say. I told the room that my daughter once opened a family album and asked me why I was not in it, and that the answer was now obvious. I had never been excluded because I was not family enough. I had been excluded because I saw what this family was built on and refused to become another woman who kept smiling while it consumed everything around her. Then I set the microphone down, walked back to our table, took my children by the hand, looked at Nathan and said, "You chose your side years ago. I'm just done pretending you didn't." And then I left. No parking lot scene, no screaming at the door, no dramatic collapse in the hallway. Just silence, because silence feels very different when it finally belongs to the person who no longer needs to explain herself. The fallout was immediate. By the next morning, half the extended family knew everything. By the end of the week, the other half did too. People who had spent years admiring Valerie from a distance suddenly remembered little stories, little strange requests, little comments that made more sense now. Once the illusion cracked, it cracked everywhere. Valerie lost the one thing she actually worshipped more than control, her reputation. She had spent years positioning herself as the gatekeeper of class, tradition, and moral standards, and now people saw a woman who had nearly bankrupted herself to maintain appearances while draining her own son and humiliating her daughter-in-law to keep the hierarchy intact. Nathan came home that night to an empty house. Not forever, but empty enough. I had taken the children to my sister's place because I needed him to sit inside the wreckage without immediately turning to me to help him manage the consequences. He called more times than I could count. He texted apologies, explanations, pleas for one conversation, promises that he had never meant for any of it to go this far. That line almost made me laugh, because men like Nathan always say that when consequences finally become public, as if damage only becomes real when it humiliates them too. When I finally agreed to meet him, it was in a therapist's office. Not at home, not over dinner, and not in private where he could too easily slide into the old language of soft regret without real accountability. He looked terrible. He cried. He admitted he had been terrified of disappointing Valerie his entire life. He admitted that every time she attacked me, some part of him knew I was right, but speaking up felt impossible because he had spent his whole childhood learning that keeping her calm mattered more than anything else. He admitted the financial betrayal had spiraled beyond what he originally intended. He admitted he kept telling himself he could fix it before I found out. He admitted he had betrayed me in 100 quiet ways, long before the money made it undeniable. I listened to all of it, and then told him the worst part was not that he failed to protect me. The worst part was that he actively protected the person hurting me from ever having to face what she was doing. That was the first thing I said that seemed to reach him in a way tears never had, because tears are not always proof of change. Sometimes they are just grief for the version of yourself you can no longer pretend to be. Valerie responded the only way women like her ever do when secrecy stops protecting them. First came denial, then outrage, then martyrdom, then selective illness, then religion, then guilt. She told people I had destroyed a family celebration out of bitterness. She said the documents were misinterpreted. She said she had only ever accepted money because Nathan insisted. She said I was jealous of her place in the family. She said I had always wanted to isolate her son. She said I could never understand dignity. That was my favorite part, because people who confuse secrecy with dignity always panic when truth enters the room. But it did not work this time. Too many people had seen too much, and too many papers existed. Even Nathan's sister, who had spent years trying to remain neutral, eventually told him flatly that he had let their mother become a tyrant because it was easier than being a grown man. And the real punishment for Nathan was not even what happened at the anniversary dinner. It was what came afterward. For the first time in his life, Valerie's full weight landed on him without me standing nearby to absorb part of it. Every demand, every guilt trip, every manipulative emergency, every accusation, every performance of suffering came straight to him. He had spent years asking me to be patient with it because some part of him had always assumed I would continue helping him survive the very thing he refused to confront. I wasn't there anymore, so now he got all of her. That is what made the final moment so satisfying. A few weeks later, Valerie created another crisis. There was some legal deadline involving the house, some payment issue, some urgent mess caused by years of lies and vanity finally colliding with reality. Nathan showed up in my kitchen looking like he had aged 10 years. He said he could not do it alone. He said his father was overwhelmed, his sister was furious, and Valerie was falling apart. Then he said the words I will never forget. He said, "Please, don't make me choose a side right now." I looked at him for a very long time before answering, because there are moments in life when you can actually hear the shape of your old self dying for good. Then I told him very calmly, "I'm not making you choose. I'm just refusing to stand where you keep putting me." He started crying immediately. He said he knew he had failed me. I told him that he had not failed me once. He had built an entire life where my pain was the price of his comfort. Then I made something very clear. I would help protect my children. I would help separate finances completely. I would help create practical systems so no more family money disappeared into Valerie's image maintenance. But I would not step back into Valerie's house. I would not comfort her. I would not rescue him from the consequences of shielding her. I would not choose family peace over my dignity ever again. He looked at me and said, "I can't do this without you." And that was the perfect final turn of the knife, because I got to answer with the only truth left in the room. I did. That sentence changed him more than therapy ever could, because in one instant he was forced to see everything at once. Every holiday where I sat there alone. Every insult I swallowed while he played peacemaker. Every private conversation where he asked me to be patient. Every dollar he moved behind my back. Every choice he made because fear of his mother mattered more than loyalty to his wife. I had survived all of that without him. Now he had to survive the consequences of it without me. That was the revenge. Not yelling, not smashing plates, not humiliating him for sport. The real revenge was far quieter and far more painful. I let him stand under the full weight of the woman he had spent years forcing me to survive. I let him feel the exhaustion, the guilt, the manipulation, the impossible demands, the constant pressure to keep her happy no matter what it cost. For nearly a decade, he had asked me to be understanding, mature, forgiving, and calm while his mother insulted me, erased me, and treated me like I would never truly belong. He thought keeping the peace made him decent. What it actually made him was comfortable at my expense. And when he finally needed me to step back into that fire and save him from the consequences of his own cowardice, I did not scream and I did not argue. I simply said no. We are not magically healed, and I am not going to lie just to make the ending sound prettier. Some wounds do not disappear just because the truth was finally spoken out loud. Some betrayals permanently change the shape of a marriage, even if the guilty person eventually understands what they have done. But what changed forever was this. Valerie no longer controlled the story, Nathan no longer got to hide inside neutrality, and my children no longer had to watch their mother absorb disrespect just to keep a room comfortable. One day my daughter asked me why I looked different before family events, and when I asked her what she meant, she said, "You don't look scared anymore." That nearly broke me, because children always know. Even when they cannot name what they are seeing, they feel it. They learn who gets protected and who gets corrected. They learn whose pain matters and whose pain is inconvenient. For years, what my daughter had been learning was that grandma could be cruel, dad would stay quiet, and mom would survive it. That was the legacy Valerie was really trying to hand down. Not family pride, not tradition, not class. Just another generation of women being asked to absorb humiliation with grace. I ended that. That matters more to me than the anniversary dinner, more than the documents, more than Valerie's face when she realized the room had turned against her. I taught my daughter that kindness does not mean availability for abuse. I taught my son that silence in the face of cruelty is not peace. It is permission. And I taught my husband that by the time a woman stops pleading and starts preparing, the real ending has already begun. If you have ever lived inside a family dynamic like this, hear me carefully. The person asking you to be the bigger person is often asking because your pain is useful to them. It keeps the room steady. It protects the bully, the liar, the manipulator, the coward. The moment you stop cooperating, they will call you dramatic, cold, divisive, unforgiving, vindictive, anything except what you really are. Finished. Because once a woman is truly finished, their confusion is no longer her responsibility. And if you made it this far, there is another story on this channel you need to watch next. It starts with a husband who vanished overnight. He drained every bank account, canceled every credit card, and left his wife with nothing. No note, no explanation, just an empty house and a stack of bills. Everyone told her to move on, but something about the way he disappeared didn't add up. So she started digging, and what she found was worse than anything she could have imagined. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more.